Good afternoon. My name is Robert Brooks, and I am a park ranger with Newport News Parks in the city of Newport News. Newport News is located in Virginia's first region. We're located on the Virginia Peninsula, and we are a part of Hampton Roads, which comprises 15 municipalities, which includes cities, towns, and counties. Give you a little information about Newport News Park. Newport News Park is the largest park east of the Mississippi River, and that is the largest municipal park. It's over 7,700 continuous acres that's all together and is not separated by anything. In our park system, in the city of Newport News, we have 36 parks. We have Newport News Park, which is, you can say, is the mothership. It's the largest park. We have a variety of other parks where we have athletic parks. We have parks with fishing piers. We have neighborhood parks that are playgrounds in the various communities in the city. And we also have Riverview Farm Park. We have Stony Run, which is an athletic complex with 5 athletic fields that host a variety of athletic events. We have Huntington Park, which includes a beach. We have several boat ramps. And we have a number of historic parks or historic sites in the city of Newport News, some that date back to the early 1600s. And we have a variety of parks, and you can do a number of things where you can do our Founders Trail, which dates back to the original colony at Jamestown, and that's British North America. And in terms of today's program, the title of the program is Black Spies in the Civil War. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to talk about contributions to the Union war effort by African American males and females. And to steal a term from my former pastor, who's a pastor emeritus at our church, we're going to tell you about heroes and sheroes. So we're not going to call the women heroes. We're going to call them sheroes. And I don't know if he submitted that anywhere to get it in the dictionary or not, but we're going to talk about heroes and sheroes. When we talk about black spies in the Civil War, we're going to be talking about what is called black dispatches. And the black dispatches were tactical and strategic intelligence that was gathered by African Americans and forwarded to the Union Army and their intelligence agencies for it to be investigated and disseminated down to the various units that were in the field. In terms of the Civil War, for you that do not know what the Civil War was, the Civil War was the war between the states. In 1861, the United States was comprised of 34 states. 11 of those states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. And they were in the Deep South and the Upper South. So you had the northern states and border states, which comprised the North, including West Virginia, that seceded from Virginia and formed its own state. And then you had 11 states that comprised the Confederacy or the South states. So it was war between the North and the South. Prior to the Civil War starting, a group of freed and some were formerly enslaved African Americans started having conventions, and one of the first conventions they had was in 1832. And part of that, they met to decide or come up with a plan on what African Americans, or back during that time they called themselves Negroes, would do. And what they wanted to do was come up with a plan to determine what they were going to do to achieve freedom for approximately, by the time the war started, 4 million enslaved persons in the United States. So they met for a number of years to decide what they were going to do. And finally, at a convention they had in Ohio in 1851, they decided that instead of participating in riots or other activities to try to gain freedom, they decided that they would align themselves with the Constitution of the United States and try to obtain freedom for their brethren that were in the South. And as part of that, they said, we believe that the preamble basically tells us what to do. And in fact, the preamble starts out with, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice," and so forth and so on. So they decided to align themselves with the Constitution. And they knew that rumors of war were spreading, and it had been spreading since the Missouri Compromise, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and the election of President Abraham Lincoln. So they knew that rumors of war were starting. So one of the things that they decided to do was they were going to train people just in case that, as they said, the Negro would be allowed to fight. But also they set up a network of spies throughout the South, and they called themselves the Loyal League, and then they were called Lincoln's Loyal League and Lincoln's Legal Loyal League. So you can use either one of the terms, but what they decided to do was to set up a network of spies, as I stated, throughout the South. And they would use everyone. They wouldn't eliminate anyone. They would use men, women, boys, girls, anyone that could pass information along. And so they set up that spy network and use it. And one of the things about the network, in 1861, Edward Pierce, who was at Fort Monroe, was talking about the communication network among the Negroes. And he told General Butler that the way the network works, that you could tell a contraband here in Virginia something, and before the end of the week, it'll be down south in the Gulf or along the Gulf Coast in Louisiana. So they had this network set up to use just in case the war started. And so one of the first things we're going to find out is, okay, what is a spy? If you go to the dictionary, it says that a spy is a person who secretly collects and reports information on the activities, movements, plans of an enemy or competitor. The Union Army decided that they were going to make theirs a little different, and they added something to it. And the Union Army decided that a spy would be a person, or the definition would be based on international law. And they said a person who secretly, in disguise or under false pretenses, seeks information with the intent of communicating it to the enemy in wartime. So they added that clause to it. And then they came up with what would be the penalty. So they said the penalty for spying, the punishment would be death. And that would be death by hanging. So the penalty of hanging spies, which was considered a capital crime, dates back to the 5th century. And why did they hang people? Usually death was instantaneous. And spying was not a crime under civilian law. So basically they decided that they would have a trial by Union. The Union and the Confederacy decided they would have a trial by military commander, so that spies would be tried and punished by the military tribunal. But in a lot of instances during the Civil War, if a spy was caught, they weren't tried. They were executed on the spot. And also during the Civil War, spies were also called scouts. So we're going to talk about the black dispatches. And as we start, some of the key leaders of that were highly influential, educated black men or African American men that were living in the North. The first slide is William Howard Day. Now, William Howard Day was considered the commander of the Loyal League. And it included other members such as Henry Highland Garnett, who was a minister in the North, and he was all of these people were at the meeting in 1851. After William Highland Garnett, we had Frederick Douglass, we had Martin Delany, and Martin Delany considered himself to be the operations officer. He was born a free man, and of course the story of Frederick Douglass, we know that Frederick Douglass was a former slave in Maryland and escaped on the Underground Railroad. We had John Mercer Langston, who was from Virginia. Mr. Langston his father was a slave owner. His mother was a former slave. And we had John S. Rock. Mr. Rock was considered to be a great orator. He was the first African American that got to practice before the Supreme Court. He tried to go to medical school, was denied, so he studied under physicians. He was an attorney, he was a dentist, a well-rounded, versatile person, as you would say. And Abraham Galloway. Abraham Galloway escaped on the Underground Railroad. Escaped from Wilmington, North Carolina, made it to Philadelphia, and then on to Canada, and he was an influential member of the Loyal League as well. And on the photograph that we have of Mr. Galloway, we can say thank you to William Steele. And Mr. Steele was also a member of this group and attended these conventions. And this photograph, or this is a pencil drawing or pen and ink drawing of Abraham Galloway. It was drawn after Mr. Steele interviewed him after he arrived in Philadelphia. And this is the only known photograph or drawing of the likeness of Mr. Galloway. And we'll talk about Mr. Galloway later on in the program. Okay, when we talk about who is a spy, look at this photograph of men, women, and children and tell me, who is a spy, or who do you think is a spy? And one of the drawbacks of that is there were hundreds of African Americans or persons of African descent that were spies for the Union Army. We don't know who all of them are. A lot of them aren't named, but one of the ways that they gain information from them is that when they came into Union lines, someone interviewed them in reference to who they were and where they came from. And one of the reasons was they could move about freely with little or no one stopping them. And then they blended in, and since they knew the terrain, they could easily hide when they were moving from point to point or place to place. There are instances where contrabands or former slaves escaped from Richmond and made it to Fort Monroe because they wanted to see if the information that they had gained through the network was true, that the Union Army would help the Negroes. And some of them stayed for a while, and then others went back and got their families. And in one instance, 23 people left Richmond trying to make it to Fort Monroe, but only 3 eventually arrived. Okay, now in terms of the military, in terms of the Union and the Confederacy, the Union had the slaves that ran away to them. In the Confederacy, they were already there. Most of them were enslaved. So when the war started, they went to war with their master or the master's children. So here's a family in Richmond. And so they held a variety of jobs in the Confederacy. So you can look at them and say that they were probably like support troops. Okay, these are Teamsters. So how could Teamsters be good spies? Because they are the ones that haul material and supplies from point A to point B. So they knew where the supply depots were. They knew where the troops were. And if they were members of the Loyal League or that spy network, they could pass information to each other as they moved from point to point. Okay, now here is a young man. As the officers are discussing tactical plans and maneuvers, they were servants in the house. So here he is pouring coffee, but he's listening intensely to what is being said. And one of the other reasons that the Negroes or men and women of African descent were good spies is because they blended in. They knew that they were servants, and they kept quiet, and they were, as they say, sly as a servant, but harmless as a dove. Okay, here are men that are working on the railroad. These are general laborers on the railroad, so they knew where the railroad lines went from point A to point B, so they knew the transportation system. So if there was a scout or spy that came through this area, they could stop and talk to them, and they would tell them exactly what was going on or where the lines went. Okay, here's some others that are working on the railroad. So they knew the transportation system as well. Okay, here's a guide with scouts that are scouting movement of troops. As the troops are moving from point A to point B, the former enslaved persons are men and women of African descent. They knew the terrain, and one of the things that we can say in terms of knowing the terrain, during the Civil War, the Union Army had maps that dated back to the Revolutionary War. And these are maps on the Virginia Peninsula. And when General McClellan started his Peninsula campaign, he was thinking the Warwick River ran north to south, but when he got here, he found out it was something entirely different. So this is a guide behind enemy lines, guiding the scouts. Okay, as we get to the war, on the Union side, we have President Abraham Lincoln, we have General George McClellan, and Allan Pinkerton. Now, Allan Pinkerton did some writing after the war, and he used the name of E.J. Allen. So you might find something by Allan Pinkerton or E.J. Allen. Now, in terms of spies, one of the first spies that Abraham Lincoln hired him and paid him out of his pocket, a gentleman by the name of William Lloyd. So President Lincoln paid him $200 to spy for him. He reported directly to him, and he was allowed to go south because he told President Lincoln that he had a business that was in the South, so he could spy for him if he gave him a passport. So President Lincoln wrote a letter. He was issued a passport, so he traveled freely through the South, him and his associates, and collected intelligence. So he was going to be paid $200 a month plus expenses. The General George McClellan eventually became commander of Union forces, or the Army of the Potomac. And when the war started, the Union really didn't have a spy agency. So they had nothing. So General McClellan knew Allan Pinkerton from when he was in Chicago. So he paid Mr. Pinkerton to spy for him. Mr. Pinkerton had his own detective agency, and he worked for the railroad. And so General McClellan hired him to be his chief spy master. And he had an agency that included 24 spies that were scattered in the North and the South. And the main place that they were located in was Washington, D.C., because there were a large number of sympathizers in Washington, D.C. So Allan Pinkerton had a number of associates, and then he had other people that was in his network. He had basically a team of 3 people that worked together, and he sent those people to Richmond. And if you've watched any movies, so forth, about modern warfare, in one of the movies, Admiral Nimitz said that General McClellan was a great organizer, but he didn't know when to fight. And even though Mr. Pinkerton had a good agency, they were civilians and they were not military trained. So a lot of the information that they collected and that he gave to General McClellan was inflated. So there was one instance where he told General McClellan that there were over, like say for instance, here on the peninsula during the Peninsula Campaign, John Bankhead Magruder had about 16,000 soldiers here on the Virginia Peninsula, and a battle took place right here in our park. And it was about 16,000 men, but by the time General McClellan got the information and sent it back to President Lincoln, he wanted more men because he thought that he was outnumbered. And he outnumbered the Confederate soldiers that were here approximately 4 to 1, well, more than 4 to 1. He had 100,000 troops. Okay, this is General Robert E. Lee. He was the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. So he was a commander of all of the Confederate forces. When the southern states seceded from the Union, the Confederate Army had the best spy network. The Union Army had none. They had no spy network. So in the beginning of the war, the South had a lot of intelligence that was disseminated and passed along from their spies in Washington, D.C. to the Confederate Army. And the first couple of years of the war, they used that to their advantage. If you look at the war itself, spying basically won individual battles, but not really affected the outcome of the entire war. Okay, this is Allan Pinkerton again, or Major or E.J. Allen. And so he had the 3 people that was in his team that he sent to Richmond was Cary Lawton, John Scobell, and Timothy Webster. Now, John Scobell was a man of African descent, and we'll talk about him a little bit later. But those were the ones, because the Confederate capital was in Richmond, so he sent his team to Richmond to spy. John Scobell basically went to the African American areas to collect intel from people that were part of the legal league, and he served as sometimes one of his disguises was he was a servant to Ms. Lawton or Timothy Webster. So they would go into an area, they would go to their assigned areas, and John Scobell would go to the areas where the majority of the people lived of African descent, and he would collect information from them to be passed on to Allan Pinkerton. Okay, here's Ms. Lawton and Timothy Webster, and this is Mr. Webster when he was captured spying. He was recognized when he was in Richmond by someone that he arrested in Washington, D.C. So he didn't use a good disguise while he was in Richmond, and Ms. Lawton is pleading for his release. And one of the questions that I have for you is, I want you to, of all of the spies that we talk about, who will pay the ultimate price for spying? And Mrs. Lawton was also called Hattie Lawton or Hattie Lawton. So she was either Hattie or Cary. If you read some information about her, you will see both Hattie and Carrie. Okay, this is John Scobell. And Mr. Scobell, in this artist rendition here, Mr. Scobell is killing 2 Confederate scouts, or you could say Secret Service agents, that were trying to capture Mrs. Lawton. And luckily he arrived just in time to save her life. One of the things about Mr. Scobell, as I mentioned, he was from Mississippi. He was formerly enslaved. His owner was a Scotsman, and he educated Mr. Scobell. He was taught to read and write, and he played a variety of parts. Like he was he worked on the docks. He played the banjo. He served as a servant, a cook, and basically he blended in while he was in Richmond and throughout the South. And later on, one of the other questions that I have for you is, what are some of the characteristics or traits that a spy must have? And one of the other things about Mr. Scobell is there's no photos of him. And if you look through primary source documents, letters, reports, and so forth from the various spy agencies, you will not find Mr. Scobell's name listed in them. You can Google him and you might get 15,000 answers, but as far as primary sources, the only source you will get is someone quoting something that they read in another book or some other document. And one of the things about Mr. Scobell, either he had good disguises or he was like during World War II, where soldiers wrote or graffiti or tagged places with "Kilroy was here." And so later on, historians are saying that John Scobell may have been one of the other persons that we're going to talk about. Now, there was another spy in Richmond that went with Mr. Scobell to a house to collect information. His name was Thomas McNiven, and he wrote a book about conversations that he wrote a book, and he included conversations he had with Timothy Webster. And Webster told him that he went with Mr. Scobell to this house back in the woods with nothing else around it. And it was pitch black dark. And he said, first there was a whistle, and then there was a return whistle as a signal. So then they go to this house, they open the door and go in, and there was another knock, and the person said, "Who goes there?" And Mr. Scobell said, "Friend of Uncle Abe." And the next response was, "What do you seek?" And Mr. Scobell said, "Life and light and liberty." And once he said that, it was like a stairwell came from the ceiling of this room. They go upstairs, go up the ladder, and there are about 40 people that are sitting around in this room. So Mr. Scobell collected information from them. So these are people that probably came from all around the neighborhood. The meeting had already been set up, Mr. Scobell went there to collect the information and pass it along to Allan Pinkerton. Okay, this is Timothy Webster. As I stated, Timothy Webster was part of the team with John Scobell and Hattie or Carrie Lawton, and he worked for Allan Pinkerton, and he was captured in Richmond, and of course he paid the ultimate price. President Lincoln tried to intercede. He contacted Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, and pleaded for Mr. Webster's life. And then finally he said, I will trade one of your spies or soldiers for Mr. Webster. But the request was denied, and Mr. Webster paid the ultimate price that's generally paid by someone caught spying. He was hanged. Okay, Allan Pinkerton was the chief of Union intelligence for a period of about 18 months. And when President Lincoln fired General McClellan took Pinkerton with him, and they took all of the notes that they had. So since there was no formal spy agency for the Union Army, they appointed two officers, one in the East and one in the West. And since we're in the East, George Sharp was appointed the spy master for the Union Army in the East. And one of the things that he did, he created the Bureau of Military Information, which basically collected information. And one of the things that he decided to do was, we're going to collect information from all sources. He interviewed contrabands. He interviewed prisoners of war. He used balloons. They tapped telegraph lines. He sent out scouts. He sent out spies. He interviewed prisoners of war. They read newspapers, and even when they were on the battlefield, soldiers were instructed to check the pockets of deceased persons on the battlefield to see if they had any intelligence that could be used for the Union Army. So after General McClellan was fired and the new commander came on board, General Hooker, and they set up the Bureau of Military Information. And by 1863, the tide of the war started to change. The Union Army was getting beat all over the South, and once they had a formalized professional agency, then they started collecting intelligence, and it wasn't inflated like the reports that came from Allan Pinkerton. So George Sharp, Colonel George Sharp, was appointed the chief of the Bureau of Military Information or Intelligence, and things started to change. Okay, here's that man again, General Benjamin Butler from Massachusetts. And General Butler was a Democrat, and he came from Massachusetts to Baltimore, put down the riots in Baltimore, was transferred to Fort Monroe, and later after Fort Monroe, he was sent south to Louisiana. And General Butler organized African American spies, or men of African descent as spies, and he interviewed all contrabands that came to Fort Monroe. And later on, one of the spies that we're going to talk about was appointed as a spy in North Carolina by General Butler. And then when General Butler went to Louisiana and they were conducting operations along the Mississippi River and trying to capture Vicksburg, General Butler sent for this gentleman, this African man of African descent, went to Louisiana and became a spy in Louisiana and Mississippi for General Butler. Okay, this lady here is Elizabeth Van Lew. Ms. Van Lew lived in Richmond, and you could say that she was a Union sympathizer. And Mrs. Van Lew had her own little spy ring called the Richmond Underground in Richmond, which was the capital of the Confederacy. She had 12 persons that worked for her that were part of her ring. And her spy ring collected information from all over Richmond. And one of the things about her is she acted as if she was mentally ill, so her nickname was Crazy Beth. And one of the things that, how she collected intelligence, she was friends with everybody. She bribed people. She even went to Libby Prison and Castle Thunder Prison in Richmond and took the Union POWs that was in those prisons. She took them food, and of course, she smuggled messages in and out for them. And a lot of them were sent to Fort Monroe. So she had a network of spies that were, some members of African descent were part of the Loyal League, where they had a relay system where messages and other information was transferred from Richmond to Fort Monroe to General Benjamin Butler. And Ms. Van Lew's spy ring operated through the entire war. And one of the things that she did when the war ended, she never left Richmond. They never really found out that she was a Union spy. They thought about it, but they weren't sure. But she went to the Union Military Department and got all of the information that they had on her and members of her spy ring. So she operated a spy ring in Richmond, in the capital of the Confederacy, and she even placed people in key positions or in various agencies within the Confederate government to spy for her. She had a baker as one of her spies. She had people of African descent as part of her spy ring, and we're going to talk about one of them later on. So that's Elizabeth Van Lew. Okay, this lady here is Mary Elizabeth Bowser. And you could say that Ms. Bowser could be called a chameleon. She was instrumental in the spy ring that was operated by Ms. Van Lew. And the reason I call her a chameleon, she was born a slave, was owned by the Van Lew family. But when John Van Lew, the father, passed away, the family freed all of their slaves. And Mary Elizabeth Bowser was one of them. What the Van Lew family did was they had her baptized. And she was baptized at the Van Lew Church instead of the First African Baptist Church in Richmond. So she was called Mary Ann Richards. So after she was baptized, Mrs. Van Lew sent her to Philadelphia to be educated. So she went to school in Philadelphia. While she was in Philadelphia for schooling, she decided that she wanted to be a missionary. So she went to Liberia as a missionary, and this is a copy of her passport. She was in Liberia for a few years, very short time, and she didn't like it, so she came back to the Van Loo house. One of the other names she used was Ellen Bond. And then another name she used was Mary Jones. And then the Bowser name, she married Mr. Bowser, but there's no record of them in terms of being married. So what Mrs. Van Loo did was she knew that President Jefferson Davis needed a servant in his house, which was the capital of the Confederacy, the Confederate White House. So she got Mrs. Bowser a job in the Confederate White House. Mary Elizabeth Bowser was there from 1861 to 1864. They said she had a photographic memory. She could look at documents and she could go back and repeat word for word what she saw and read. There's an account by Thomas McNiven that ran the bakery. That was her contact. Sometimes he delivered bread and bakery products to the Confederate White House, and other times she went to his store to collect information. So she delivered intelligence by a variety of means, and then it was passed down the line. They passed intelligence in bread, vegetables, eggs. She had it sewn into her dress, in her hat, and the information was passed along. So she was an instrumental member in the Richmond Underground of Elizabeth Van Loo. As the war in 1864, she thought that they knew who she were and decided that she was going to leave. And that was one of the times where Jefferson Davis caught her in the room, and she told him that she made a mistake, and he believed her. And to show you what type of a cunning person she was, she even slipped into the Confederate Congress and hid in the closet to collect information. So once she thought that they knew who she was, that she was a spy, what she decided to do is, it's time to leave. So she tried to burn down the Confederate White House, but she was unsuccessful. And when they were interviewed, when the Davises were interviewed, Mrs. Verena Davis, who was Jefferson Davis' wife, said, I didn't have a Negro in my house that could read and write. They had a number of servants, including a young boy that they bought from Mississippi that was in their house with them. And she said one of the slaves the person that was enslaved in her house, name was Betsy. And one of the Confederate sympathizers, Miss Mary Chestnut, even talked about, she said that she didn't see a Mary Jane Richards or a Mary Elizabeth Bowser or Ellen Bond in the White House. The one person that she had contact with during her visits was named Betsy. And she said that Betsy couldn't read or write. So we don't know if Mary Elizabeth Bowser was Betsy or not. But she left, and after the war ended, she moved to Georgia, and she was a school teacher for the Freedmen's Bureau. She married a couple of times, or she said she was married, because after she left the Confederate White House, she signed her name Mary Jane Richards Gavin. there's no record of her and Mr. Gavin getting married. And when she applied for the job with the Freedmen's Bureau in Georgia, she wrote a letter to the superintendent and told him that she wanted to come, but she wasn't there, but they could go and interview her husband, and her husband would vouch for her and her credentials. So she's living in Georgia after the war, and she said that her husband was Mr. Denman, and Mr. Denman was a Caucasian male. So you can imagine a black woman living in Georgia with a white husband right after the Civil War. But she said that things got bad. She closed the school and moved to Philadelphia. And then she went to New York. And there are some copies of letters that she wrote to Elizabeth Van Lew while she in the 1870s, while she was in New York, and Mrs. Van Lew's daughter vouched for Mary Elizabeth Bowser or Mary Jane Richards, Allan Bond, but this was the chameleon of the Spies that Mrs. Van Lew had. And this was probably her best spy. Another spy that was part of the Van Lew network is William Jackson. Now, William Jackson was hired as a coachman for Jefferson Davis. And they thought that he was illiterate. But Mr. Jackson could read and write. So you can imagine some of the conversations that he listened to. So in the latter part of 1861, Mr. Jackson escaped and made his way to Fort Monroe. And the last they heard of Mr. Jackson, he was taken on a tour, a speaking tour in England by the American Missionary Association. And as part of the contract that Jefferson Davis had with Mr. Jackson's owner, if Mr. Jackson escaped or was killed, then he had to pay him $400 for Mr. Jackson. So Mr. Jackson escaped from the Confederate White House, and he was touring in Europe. And there are letters on file to William Lloyd Garrison in reference to Mr. Jackson. And they say that as part of Mr. Jackson's tour in England, that probably some of the things that he said kept England from entering the war as a supporter of the Confederate States of America. So Mr. Jackson escaped, went on the speaking tour and went to England and basically disappeared after that. Okay, this is a photograph that these are Pinkerton's men eating. So we don't know if that is Mr. Scobell or not, but that's the only photograph of a person of African descent with Allan Pinkerton and his other operatives. And Allan Pinkerton is sitting in the back. So that may have been Mr. Scobell. We're not sure. Okay. William Brisby. Mr. Brisby was from New Kent County. He was of African and Native American descent. During the war, he was going to be in 1861, 1862, he was going to be impressed into Confederate service because what they were trying to do during the Peninsula Campaign, they were building earthworks to try to delay General McClellan and his troops from approaching Richmond. But Mr. Brisby was an educated man. and he had equipment that was used in shoeing horses. So what he decided to do was he said, hey, I'm a blacksmith and I can shoe your horses. So he was with the Confederate cavalry shoeing their horses. And once that was over, later on during the war, he bought a boat, and he was a fisherman, plus he sold produce and vegetables, and he took them to Richmond to be sold. And as part of his trip back and forth from Richmond to Newport County, he delivered information from the Van Loo network south toward Fort Monroe. And he also bought contraband slaves that were running away from the Richmond area, and also the prisoners of war that Mrs. Van Loo and her underground were able to help escape from Castle Thunder and Libby Prison camp. Libby Prison came to him, and they were put on his boat and then brought back to Union lines off Fort Monroe. Now there are some other people that we do not have pictures of, and I'll tell you about them. One of the first ones is George Scott. Now George Scott was an escaped slave from a farm around Yorktown. He ran away and he went to Hampton. And while he was in the town of Hampton, they found out that he was escaped. So he was captured and jailed in the Hampton jail. While he was in the jail one night, the guard came in to feed him. Mr. Scott subdued the guard and ran away and hid out in the woods. So while he was hiding in the woods, the citizens of Hampton fed him. General Butler heard about him, had an interview with him, and he found out that Mr. Scott knew where the fortifications were between Yorktown and Fort Monroe. So General Butler asked him if he would go with his officers on a reconnaissance to show them where the Confederate troops were. And one of the things that General Butler told them when he wrote the order, he said, give George Scott a weapon. So here's a runaway slave being given a firearm by the Union Army, and he took them on scouting missions that showed them where Big Bethel was and Little Bethel. They collected the intelligence, and of course, we know that the Union Army was defeated at Big Bethel. One of the other slaves, or a free person of African descent from Nansemond County, where Suffolk is located, was James Bowser. James Bowser was a free black, and he decided that he wanted to help the people in his community. There were a number of sympathizers in the area that knew of his activities. So one night they went to his house, called him out, took him and his son out in the woods, severely beat them, and then, because it was a mob, some of them said, let's kill them both. And there were others in the group that said, no, we shouldn't do that. So they decided that they would execute Mr. Bowser. They made his son watch, and then let his son go, and told his son to go back and tell everybody else, all the other Negroes in the area, what happened to Spies. And this account of what happened to Mr. Bowser was verified in 1937. During the Depression, writers from the Works Progress Administration traveled around the South and interviewed former slaves, and this interview or this information was given to them during an interview in 1937. Another free person was William Ringo. And Mr. Ringo was a free man of African descent also, and he operated a riverboat on the York River. He was impressed, moved Confederate supplies and troops from down the York River to Yorktown. And when his ship broke down, they let him go, and then he went to Baltimore, and then he went to Washington and gave intelligence officials the information that General McClellan used during the Peninsula Campaign. One of the other ones was Mary Lavestry, or you will see her name, Mary Trevesky. She worked for the engineers that were converting the Merrimack to the CSS Virginia. She was a seamstress and in Norfolk. So the engineer was her owner. So when she used to take him meals, she decided that she would steal the blueprints and try to get them to Washington. What she eventually did was she took tissue paper that she had, that she used in her business, and traced the drawings. She told her master she wanted to go visit her former master up in the Fredericksburg area. And he let her go. He gave her a pass. And of course, she used the Teamsters to go to Fredericksburg. Then she got in with and met members of the Lawyer League, and they took her to Washington, D.C., and she delivered the blueprints to Gideon Welles. And the Union Army sped up construction on the Merrimack, or the Monitor, and it eventually came to Fort Monroe. And of course, we had the Battle of the Ironclads. The other person that really helped Union intelligence was Charlie Wright. And Charlie Wright was a contraband that lived in the Culpeper, Virginia area. Couldn't read or write, but he had an excellent memory. And he was captured by Union forces around Culpeper. And so they interviewed him. And you wouldn't believe the information he gave them. He was able to identify 12 Confederate units that belonged to Generals Ewell and Longstreet. And of course, General Hooker had some of the information as well, but using the information that Mr. Wright provided them, they were able to determine that Lee's army was moving to Maryland en route to Pennsylvania. And they used that information to put scouts to screen between the Confederate forces that was moving through the valley toward Pennsylvania and Washington, D.C. And of course, the Union Army was able to get to Gettysburg before the Confederate Army got there. And they knew that also that General Pickett's unit was the trail unit. So, and of course, we know that the Battle of Gettysburg, the Union Army won the Battle of Gettysburg. Okay, next person, Robert Smalls, young man, older man. Robert Smalls was a pilot of the Planter, which was a Confederate supply ship that moved supplies up and down around Charleston in South Carolina. So one night, while he was a slave, he wanted to buy the freedom for him and his family, and he was unable to do so. So he decided with the other crewmen on the Planter that they came up with a plan and they would steal the ship. And of course, while the officers left the ship in Charleston, Mr. Smalls put on his coat and hat, and he knew all the signals. And of course, he left Charleston Harbor, went by Fort Sumter, gave all the correct toots of the whistle and the signal. He was about the same height. He knew how the commander of the ship stood, and they allowed him to go out. And of course, he delivered the planter to the Union Navy. And he was given a reward of $1,500 for delivering that ship to the Union Navy. And during that time, during the rest of the war, he was captain or pilot of several other ships in the Charleston, South Carolina, Georgia area. And of course, after the war, Mr. Smalls was elected to the South Carolina General Assembly, and later on he was elected to Congress. So he was a member of the United States Congress representing the state of South Carolina. Next person, for you that don't know who she is Harriet Tubman, or Mittie Ross, and she was considered the greatest conductor on the Underground Railroad. She found out that when the war started, she left Canada and came to Fort Monroe and volunteered her services to the Union Army. And because there were more contrabands in South Carolina on the islands, they sent her to South Carolina. And so she was a spy, a cook, a nurse, a guide, and she performed a lot of other duties while she was in South Carolina. And one of the key things about the life of Harriet Tubman in her service to the Union Army as a civilian, she led a raid on the Combahee River. She put together a network of scouts and spies that scouted that entire area for the Union Army. They went up the river, they plotted where all the fortifications were and all the mines. And so she led a raid up the river with Colonel James Montgomery. And if you watch the movie Glory, there's a scene in there where Harriet Tubman leads them up the Combahee River, freed over 700, and she said 756 slaves that she was able to free. And then she came back. At the end of the war, she came back to Fort Monroe in 1865 and served as a nurse in the hospital for contrabands and the U.S. colored troops. She was only there a couple of months. She didn't like the treatment. She thought that the people were receiving inferior treatment, so she decided to leave and go back to New York. She was given a pass that gave her passage by train from Virginia to New York. The conductor on the train saw her sitting in the area where Negroes or people of African descent were not supposed to sit. So he told her, said, "Get up and move." And she refused. And he said, "Get up and move." And she refused again. So he called for assistance. Now, Harriet Tubman was a small woman, about 5 feet tall. It took 4 men to remove her from her seat in the passenger compartment of the train. They carried her to the baggage car, threw her in, and locked the door. And of course, she stayed in the baggage compartment of the train from Virginia all the way to Auburn, New York. And of course, she was an abolitionist. She was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And so while she was in Auburn, New York, she couldn't get a pension. So she was able to get the pension of her husband. She was married twice. Whenever you see information about her as Harriet Tubman, that was her. Tubman, John Tubman, was her first husband. Her second husband was Nelson Davis, that was a member of the U.S. Colored Troops. Mr. Davis was 22 years younger than Mrs. Tubman, so in our day and time, the people would call her a cougar. And of course, Mr. Davis died before she did. So she was able to collect his pension. They wouldn't give her a pension because she was not in the federal service. William Seward, who was the Secretary of State during the Lincoln and Johnson administration, was also from New York. So he assisted her in getting a house in Auburn, New York, and she turned it into a home for the aged. And she died, when she died in New York in 1913, in Auburn, she was given a funeral with full military honors. So the house is still there, and now her residence is administered by the National Park Service in Auburn, New York, and she is buried in the cemetery in Auburn as well. The last gentleman that we're going to talk about is Abraham Galloway. Now, Mr. Galloway, as I stated earlier, escaped on the Underground Railroad. Went from Philadelphia to Canada. Once the war ended, or the war started, he came back and he met up with General Benjamin Butler. So General Butler decided that he would put him in charge of all the spies in North Carolina. So he was the chief of spy operations for General Butler in North Carolina. And he basically operated through the eastern part of the state because that's where the contraband camps were located, around New Bern, Roanoke Island, in the Wilmington area. So Mr. Galloway was the chief of intelligence for General Butler. Well, when General Butler was sent to New Orleans to assist there, he sent for Mr. Galloway. And Mr. Galloway came to Louisiana, and he told him, said, we need intel up the Mississippi River because we're planning an operation against Vicksburg. So Mr. Galloway went to Mississippi and scouted the area around Vicksburg. And of course, we know that General Grant captured Vicksburg later on. And basically, once Vicksburg was captured, the Union Army controlled the Mississippi River. Mr. Galloway was captured in Mississippi. And they don't know how he escaped. But later on, by the end of 1863, Mr. Galloway was back in North Carolina. So he went to Wilmington. He got his mother. His mother was a slave. His father was white. He got his mother and sent her to Boston. And he organized the spy ring and all of the slaves in North Carolina. And before the war ended, in 1864, things were looking bad for the Union Army, so to speak. Enlistments were down in terms of African Americans, and enlistments were ending by other Northern troops throughout the Union Army. And Mr. Galloway was upset about the treatment that the U.S. colored troops were receiving, mainly the massacre at Fort Pillow. And he was upset because this is how they were treating men of African descent that were in the Union Army. So he got together with 4 other members of his ring, and they went to Washington, D.C. to meet President Lincoln. And he told President Lincoln, he said, we will continue to help you, but you must help us. And in order to help us, you have to guarantee that when we win the war, you will give us freedom. So that would be freedom for men of African descent. And he said, also, you will guarantee us political rights. And those were things that the Loyal League, and that was discussed in those conventions, and that was what was voted on in 1851. So President Lincoln guaranteed that he would help them, and they said, okay, I will help you. He went back to North Carolina and organized 3 regiments, 3 U.S. colored troop infantry regiments for the Union Army. The 35th, 36th, and 37th U.S. colored troops. Of course, the war ended. The Union Army won the war. Amendments to the Constitution were passed. Of course, President Lincoln was assassinated, but they passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. And they were free. So then Mr. Galloway was active in politics in North Carolina. He was involved in a number of organizations that fought for rights of African American citizens. He was a member of the National Equal Rights League, and he was finally elected to the state senate in North Carolina. And they say that Mr. Galloway he had a sense of humor, but he was an in-your-face type of person. And he carried 2 pistols with him that he kept in his belt. And they're not sure if he had them with him when he went to the White House or not. But sympathizers in North Carolina after the war ended were very upset with Mr. Galloway. They tried to assassinate him twice, but they were unsuccessful. But then he became suddenly ill and died of, they say, jaundice and fever at the age of 33. And just to give you some type of how he was revered in the area, they say that over 6,000 people attended his funeral. And there have been a couple of books written about him. There was an exhibit at the North Carolina History Museum last year. There's a couple of historical markers in North Carolina around Wilmington to him as well. So Mr. Galloway was a member of the Loyal League. He attended the conventions, but then he also became a spy. And for people that don't know who he is, we can say thank you to William Steele for having this drawing made of Abraham Galloway, because there's no other photograph of him that exists. And as I stated earlier, some historians are saying Abraham Galloway and John Scobell were the same person, but they can't prove it. And I've checked some primary source documents, reports, and so forth. I've looked through some, but I haven't been able to find him in any of the reports. And I went through a book where Benjamin Butler, that lists a lot of Benjamin Butler's letters and so forth, private correspondence that he wrote, and Mr. Galloway is not listed in his book. And these are private correspondence and letters while he was at Fort Monroe and while he was at Louisiana, and then when he returned to Virginia. But nothing on Abraham Galloway. Okay, these are some tools that spies used. So I want you to look at some of them and tell me which ones were used during the Civil War. And if you really want to think about it, we can be like Captain Picard telling Mr. Data to turn the Enterprise around. Let's go back in time by creating a temporal vortex, and then we'll go back and we can look at what was used or tools that spies used. We have the wiretap on the telephone, balloons, spy plane, SR-71 Blackbird, or invisible ink, a hidden microphone, a satellite, ciphers, eavesdropping, carrier pigeons, surveillance camera, disguises, and hackers. And one of the things that has hindered a lot of information in terms of who some of the spies were and what they accomplished while spying. Some of the records, spy records from the Civil War, some of the first ones weren't released until 1956. Spy records from George Washington's spy ring, some of them weren't released until the 1860s. Not the 1860s, the 1960s. So if you were to go back and look, they used balloons. They had invisible ink during that time. They eavesdropped. They used ciphers, used disguises, and they used carrier pigeons as one of the means of transferring or transmitting information from one place to another. And as I stated, Elizabeth Van Lew collected her information. Mary Elizabeth Bowser collected hers. When the Confederate Army and the government evacuated Richmond, they burned the majority of their records that were there, that things that they didn't take with them. Most of their intelligence records were burned. Of course, when General McClellan was fired by President Lincoln, all his papers were considered personal, and he took them. And of course, Allan Pinkerton took his records as well, and some of them were burned in the Great Chicago Fire. And so we don't have a lot of information from him. But he did write a book about his exploits as a spy master for the Union Army. But historians will tell you that they believe his book was just like the intelligence information that he transmitted to Union commanders. It was fabricated and inflated. And that's why they say that they don't believe that John Scobell existed either, because in reports and information that they do have from Allan Pinkerton or E.J. Allen, you won't find John Scobell in any of them. Not even reports from Hattie, Lawton, or Timothy Webster. So that concludes the presentation on black spies in the Civil War. Does anyone have questions or need some additional information? Okay, hearing none, would like to say on behalf of the Director of Newport News Parks, Recreation, and Tourism, Mr. Michael Poplowski, I want to thank you for joining our program, Black Spies in the Civil War, and we will be having additional programs this year. and they will be announced on our Facebook page and our parks calendar. A lot of them are listed on the parks calendar that you can purchase from the visitor center at City Center or the visitor center in Newport News Park. And you can also find out about some of our programs through the consortium that does American Civil War, which encompasses Hampton, Gloucester, Williamsburg, National Park Service, Isle of Wight County, Norfolk. There's a variety of organizations that participate in that consortium, and we advertise each other's programs in a little bulletin that we put out, and then information is also disseminated at various programs that are open for in-person attendance. So on behalf of everyone and for the camera operator that assisted me, Mrs. Doak, we would like to say again, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.